All right, so today we're going to kind of dive into some pretty interesting stuff. You know, geopolitical waters. You've got that big meeting coming up with your international colleagues.
Right.
And you want to really understand all the chatter that's surrounding, you know, a potential end to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So we're going to go deeper than the usual headlines, and we're going to tap into a unique source today.
Okay.
A Russian language political commentary show
Interesting.
with a decidedly pro-Russia stance.
Okay.
Now, remember, we're here to analyze,
Right.
not endorse.
Of course.
So let's unpack this together.
What I found really interesting in this commentary is it just keeps circling back to one central figure,
Okay.
Donald Trump.
Really?
The anticipation of his potential return to the presidency.
They're really banking on a Trump comeback, huh?
It seems that way.
But how does that tie into the war in Ukraine?
Well, the source suggests that European leaders are kind of on edge,
I see.
anticipating a pretty big shift in U.S. involvement in Europe and NATO if Trump gets back in. They believe he would prioritize a swift end to the war, potentially through a deal with Putin.
So they see Trump as a wild card then,
Yeah,
a potential disruptor to the current balance of power.
exactly. The source even argues that some European nations might be tempted to engage in what's known as bandwagoning
Bandwagoning.
in international relations,
I'll say.
aligning with the perceived stronger power.
So like,
Imagine it this way. You're at your meeting,
right.
and suddenly there's a shift in the room.
Okay.
Everyone's gravitating toward one person, the one with the most influence, the perceived winner.
Got it.
Yeah.
But why does the source think that this bandwagoning strategy is flawed?
Well, they argue that it's a short-sighted approach based solely on immediate power dynamics. It overlooks the potential long-term consequences of aligning with a leader like Trump, whose foreign policy can be
Unpredictable.
very unpredictable.
That's true. He definitely shook things up in his first term,
Right.
especially his approach to NATO.
Right. Yeah. A lot of European leaders were unsettled by that.
This begs the question, what kind of peace deal are they even envisioning?
That's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
The source is quite skeptical of a proposed peacekeeping force.
Really?
They view it less as a genuine effort to ensure peace and more as a power play by the West.
Interesting. So peace in name only then,
Potentially, yeah.
with ulterior motives at play.
Yeah.
That's a pretty cynical take.
It is cynical,
Yeah.
but it highlights a key point.
Which is?
The source is adamant that true peace must guarantee Ukrainian sovereignty,
Okay.
not just an absence of fighting.
So not a peace dictated by external forces,
Right.
but one that genuinely reflects the will and interests of the Ukrainian people.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
And this brings us to another crucial aspect highlighted in the source,
Okay.
the human cost of this war,
Yeah.
particularly for Ukrainians themselves.
Well,
There's this chilling quote that really stood out to me. The problem in Ukraine is not that they're running out of money, but that they're running out of Ukrainians.
wow. That's a stark assessment.
It is,
It
yeah.
really makes you think about the toll this war is taking on the people who are directly involved.
Yeah.
What implications does the source draw from this observation?
They connect it to the calls for increased mobilization in Ukraine,
Okay.
pointing out that there's a growing reluctance, especially among young people, to participate.
Interesting. So a growing sense of war fatigue.
Potentially even disillusionment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely something to consider for your upcoming meeting for sure.
Right.
But I'm curious about something else.
Okay.
The source compares this conflict to other wars, like the wars in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
How do they distinguish between them?
They argue that Western powers, while often seeking to minimize their own casualties,
Right.
have historically inflicted high civilian casualties in conflicts like Iraq. This war, they claim, is different. The majority of casualties are among combatants.
So a much more personal and immediate cost
Yeah.
for the Ukrainian people.
Exactly.
That's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
It seems like the source is also really focused on the internal political landscape in Ukraine.
Yeah, definitely.
Can you elaborate on that?
They argue that the lack of elections during wartime, while maybe beneficial for politicians, effectively silences the voices of the Ukrainian people.
So the only avenue for expressing discontent then is through,
Actions like fleeing the country or evading the draft.
wow, what they call voting with their feet.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
This source seems deeply concerned about the lack of agency,
Mm-hmm.
the inability of Ukrainians to have a real say in their own future.
Right.
It's almost as if they see this potential peace deal as just another form of external control.
That's a very astute observation.
Thank you.
And it leads us to a crucial concept.
Okay.
The significance of elections as a contract between citizens and their government. Right. In the absence of this contract, there's a fundamental disconnect between those in power and the people they govern.
So a lack of accountability then.
Yeah.
A lack of representation.
Right.
Makes you wonder how sustainable any peace can be without addressing these core issues.
It's definitely a question worth considering as you prepare for your meeting.
Yeah.
Imagine yourself in that room.
Okay.
How might this lack of a contract, this sense of disenfranchisement, impact the long-term stability of any peace agreement? It's a perspective that could really enrich the conversation and offer a unique understanding of the situation on the ground.
It's incredibly helpful.
Good.
So we've covered a lot about how this source views the potential for peace.
Right.
And its impact on Ukraine.
Yeah.
But what about the aftermath?
Right.
What happens after a peace deal?
Right.
Does the source offer any insights into that?
They delve into the potential role of the military in post-war Ukrainian politics. They suggest that the government is already taking steps to limit the military's political influence.
So they're trying to avoid a scenario where military figures might leverage their wartime experience to gain political power.
Yeah, perhaps fearing a power grab in the wake of the conflict.
It's almost like they're trying to avoid a repeat of history. Didn't something similar happen in post-war Germany?
You're right to draw that parallel.
Okay.
The source specifically points out that post-war Germany saw a return of established politicians.
Right.
Not a sudden influx of military figures into leadership roles.
I see.
They seem to be suggesting that Ukraine might be wise to learn from this historical precedent.
So they're advocating for a more measured approach.
It seems so.
A transition back to civilian leadership that avoids any potential destabilization.
Right.
That makes sense, especially if they're prioritizing long-term stability and a genuine peace for Ukraine.
Yeah.
But there's one more thing I'm curious about. The source seems pretty dismissive of some of the speculation in Western media about what Putin might offer Trump in exchange for ending the war.
Oh, yeah. They touch on a few points that caught my eye.
Right.
For instance, they completely dismiss that idea of space cooperation as a potential bargaining chip.
Really?
They see it as either Western propaganda or simply naive analysis.
It sounds like they're skeptical of anything coming from Western sources at this point.
Yeah.
Almost like you're saying, don't believe the hype.
Exactly. And this skepticism is directly tied to their broader call for what they call intellectual sovereignty.
Yes, that phrase keeps popping up. But I admit I'm still not entirely clear on what they mean by it. It sounds like they're advocating for independent thinking, but is there more to it than that?
There is. They're essentially urging their audience to resist the influence of external forces, particularly Western media and political establishments, when forming their understanding of the situation.
So don't let those narratives dictate your perception.
Exactly.
Okay.
Instead, dig deeper, seek out diverse viewpoints, and ultimately form your own conclusions based on evidence and reason.
I see.
Think of it like this.
Okay.
You're at that meeting.
Right.
And everyone's echoing the same talking points, the same prepackaged narratives. What if you, armed with this unique perspective from a Russian source, were able to challenge those assumptions, offer a fresh interpretation, and spark a more nuanced discussion?
That's a really powerful way to frame it.
It's not just about rejecting Western narratives.
Okay.
It's about having the confidence to think critically, to question everything, and to arrive at your own informed understanding of the situation. It's almost like intellectual self-reliance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that kind of independent thinking can be so valuable, especially in a complex situation like this, where there are so many competing narratives and agendas at play.
Exactly.
So we've uncovered a lot here.
We have.
Skepticism towards Western narratives, a focus on Ukrainian sovereignty, and this intriguing call for intellectual sovereignty.
It's a lot to think about.
I'm already feeling much better prepared for my meeting.
Good.
But before we move on, I want to make sure we haven't missed anything crucial.
Sure.
Any other key insights from the source that you think our listeners should be aware of?
Well, there's one more thread I think is crucial for your meeting prep.
What?
Remember how we talked about the human cost of the war?
Yeah.
The source goes beyond just stating facts and figures. They paint a picture of what they believe a truly successful peace would look like for Ukraine.
You mean more than just a ceasefire or a withdrawal of troops?
Yes. They argue that true peace can't be achieved by simply silencing the guns.
Okay.
It requires creating a future where Ukrainians are not just surviving, but thriving.
Okay.
They use this powerful phrase, being happy and secure, not just survive.
That's a really poignant way to put it.
Yeah.
They're talking about something much deeper than just the absence of war, aren't they?
Exactly. It's about a sense of hope, the ability to rebuild lives, to dream again.
Yeah.
They suggest that a truly successful peace would allow Ukrainians to reclaim their sense of agency, to have a voice in shaping their own destiny,
Okay.
and to pursue their own vision of happiness.
Thinking about your meeting, this adds another layer of complexity.
Right.
It's not just about geopolitical strategy. It's about people's lives, their hopes for the future.
You hit the nail on the head. The source seems to believe that true peace requires addressing not only the physical and economic damage of war, but also the psychological and social wounds.
So it's about healing the fabric of society.
Yeah.
Restoring trust
Yeah.
and creating an environment where people can feel safe, secure, and empowered to rebuild their lives.
Exactly.
So going into that meeting,
Yeah.
you can bring a more nuanced perspective.
Right.
It's not just about negotiating borders or troop withdrawals. It's about understanding what peace truly means for the people who have lived through this conflict.
And that leads us to another intriguing point. Okay. The source seems to suggest that a truly independent Ukraine, free from the influence of both Russia and the West, is essential for achieving this kind of peace.
That's a bold statement.
It is.
They're essentially saying that external influence, regardless of where it comes from, is detrimental to Ukraine's long-term well-being.
It's a perspective that challenges some common assumptions, wouldn't you say?
It does. It goes back to that idea of intellectual sovereignty.
Right.
They're arguing that true peace and prosperity can only be achieved when Ukrainians are free to make their own choices, determine their own future, and chart their own course without feeling beholden to any external power.
It's a compelling argument. Imagine bringing that perspective to your meeting.
Okay, yeah.
It could really shift the conversation from a purely geopolitical framework to one that centers the needs and aspirations of the Ukrainian people.
Exactly. You could even pose a question to your colleagues.
Oh, yeah.
What would a truly successful peace look like from the perspective of ordinary Ukrainians? Not just from the perspective of governments and international organizations. It's a question that could spark some fascinating discussion.
That's a brilliant idea. I love how this deep dive is not only informing me, but also giving me concrete ways to engage in these complex conversations.
Good, I'm glad. But speaking of complexity,
Okay.
this whole discussion about peace and sovereignty makes me wonder about the broader implications of this conflict. What does this deep dive tell us about the state of global affairs?
That's a great question, and it brings us to one of the most important takeaways from this source: the critical importance of critical thinking.
Okay.
In a world that's absolutely saturated with information, especially during times of conflict,
Yeah, that's true.
this source is highly skeptical of narratives coming from Western media and governments.
Okay.
Whether you agree with their assessment or not, it highlights the need to question the information we're constantly bombarded with.
So don't just take things at face value, even if it's coming from sources you typically trust.
Precisely. In today's world, information is a powerful tool that's often used to shape public opinion and advance specific agendas.
Right.
It's like we're living in a constant information war where truth can be a casualty.
That's a sobering thought.
Yeah,
It makes you realize the importance of being an informed and discerning consumer of information.
absolutely. This source's call for intellectual sovereignty is essentially a call to action.
Okay.
It's about developing those critical thinking skills, learning how to discern fact from fiction, and recognizing the biases and motivations that often underlie the information we encounter.
So it's like having a superpower you can take into your meeting.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It's about becoming an active participant in the information landscape, not just a passive recipient.
Okay.
And it's about recognizing that we all have a responsibility to be informed citizens, to engage in civil discourse, and to hold those in power accountable.
That's a powerful message, and it speaks to the broader relevance of this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just about understanding a specific conflict.
Right.
It's about equipping ourselves with the tools we need to navigate a world that's becoming increasingly complex and interconnected.
You've summed it up perfectly.
Thank you.
And it's a reminder that the quest for knowledge is an ongoing journey. It requires curiosity, humility, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Because the more we learn, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
And that's a good thing.
It is.
It keeps us humble, keeps us curious, and keeps us striving to learn and grow.
Speaking of growth, this deep dive has certainly expanded my thinking about this conflict.
Good.
But I'm also feeling a bit overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of it all.
Yeah.
Is there any way to reconcile these competing narratives, these divergent perspectives?
That's a question that plagues everyone trying to make sense of this conflict.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's no easy answer, but I think this source offers a glimmer of hope. Amidst all the talk of geopolitics and power struggles, they keep coming back to the human element. They remind us that peace is not just an abstract concept, it's about people's lives, their hopes, their dreams.
So even in the midst of all this complexity, there's still room for empathy,
Yeah,
for compassion, for recognizing the shared humanity that connects us all.
exactly. And I think that's a powerful message to hold on to, especially as you prepare for your meeting. Remember, you're not just discussing strategies and policies, you're talking about people's lives. Bring that human element into the conversation.
You're right. It's easy to get lost in the geopolitical chess game,
Yeah.
but ultimately this conflict is about real people, real lives, and the future of a nation.
And that's why this deep dive has been so valuable.
I agree.
It's not just given us information, it's given us a framework for understanding, for empathizing, for engaging with this conflict on a deeper level.
Okay, so we've talked about peace, about power, about narratives,
Right.
and about the very nature of truth itself.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one more thread I want to pull on before we wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
The idea of agency,
Right.
the ability to act and to make a difference in the world.
Mm-hmm.
The source seems to be deeply concerned about the sense of powerlessness that many Ukrainians are experiencing.
They argue that being caught in the middle of a conflict largely driven by external forces has created a sense of helplessness, a feeling that they have very little control over their own destiny.
And they even suggest that the only way for many Ukrainians to express their discontent is through actions like fleeing the country or dodging the draft.
Yay.
It's a pretty stark image.
Remember that phrase they used, voting with their feet?
Right.
It speaks volumes about the feeling of disenfranchisement, the lack of agency that many are experiencing.
It's heartbreaking to think about, but it also raises a crucial question. How do we reclaim our agency in a world that often feels like it's spinning out of control?
That's a question that's been pondered by philosophers and activists for centuries. And while there's no easy answer, I think this source offers a starting point.
Which is?
They remind us that even small actions can make a difference.
So it's about finding those points of leverage where we can exert our influence, even if it seems insignificant in the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that we're not alone in this struggle. There are countless individuals and organizations around the world working to create a more just and equitable future.
So it's about finding those communities, those networks of support,
Yeah.
and working together to amplify our voices and create a collective force for change.
Because none of us can solve these problems alone.
Right.
It requires collaboration, solidarity, and a shared belief in the possibility of a better world.
And that's where hope comes in, isn't
Yeah.
it? That belief that our actions, no matter how small, can contribute to something larger than ourselves.
That's right, Lily. It's that spark of possibility, that refusal to give up that keeps us moving forward, even when the odds seem stacked against us.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to encourage you, our listener, to hold on to that sense of hope, to embrace that agency, and to remember that you have the power to make a difference in the world.
Because even amidst the chaos and uncertainty, there's always room for action, for compassion, and for the pursuit of a more just and equitable future.
And that's a journey worth taking, isn't it?
It is.
Not just for ourselves, but for all those who will come after us.
It's a legacy worth leaving behind, one that reflects our deepest values and our unwavering belief in the potential of humanity.
This deep dive has been incredibly illuminating,
Good.
and I'm feeling much more prepared for my meeting.
I'm glad to hear that.
But before we conclude, there's one last aspect of the source I want to explore. They were quite critical of Western narratives surrounding this conflict, weren't they?
Yes, and that criticism ties directly into their call for intellectual sovereignty. They're essentially urging their audience to resist blindly accepting the narratives presented to them, especially those coming from Western media and political establishment.
It's about developing that critical lens.
Right.
The ability to question everything, to seek out alternative perspectives, and to form your own opinions based on evidence and reason.
Exactly. In a world where information is constantly being manipulated and weaponized, intellectual sovereignty is more important than ever.
It's about reclaiming our minds, our thoughts, and our ability to make informed decisions about the world around us.
And recognizing that the narratives we consume shape our understanding of reality,
Right.
making it crucial to be discerning about what we choose to believe.
Because if we're not careful, we can end up in echo chambers surrounded by information that merely reinforces our existing biases.
Which is why it's so important to expose ourselves to diverse perspectives, engage with people who think differently, and be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
The truth is often complex and nuanced,
It is.
rarely fitting neatly into prepackaged narratives.
It requires digging deeper, asking tough questions, and being willing to sit with discomfort.
Real learning and growth often occur outside our comfort zones, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. That's what this deep dive has been all about, pushing ourselves to think critically, question authority, and develop our own understanding of the world.
And recognizing our responsibility as informed citizens to engage in civil discourse and hold those in power accountable.
A healthy democracy relies on an informed and engaged citizenry, one capable of independent thought and making decisions based on evidence and reason.
As we move towards the conclusion of this deep dive, I want to encourage our listener to continue on this path of intellectual exploration. Keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and never stop seeking truth.
The world is full of wonder and complexity, and the more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know.
And that's what makes the journey so rewarding. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about the process of discovery, the joy of learning, and the constant evolution of our understanding.
It's about embracing intellectual curiosity, that thirst for knowledge, and using it to navigate the challenges and opportunities of our time.
And recognizing that we're all part of a larger conversation, a collective effort to make sense of the world and create a more just and equitable future.
So let's keep talking, keep learning, and keep pushing ourselves to think critically and act courageously.
Because the world needs more engaged citizens, more informed voices, and more people willing to stand up for what they believe in.
And that's a legacy worth striving for, wouldn't you say? One that reflects our deepest values and our unwavering belief in the possibility of a better tomorrow.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey, and I'm feeling much more equipped to engage in meaningful conversations about this complex issue. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something the source emphasized. Their vision of a successful peace in Ukraine.
They went beyond the usual talking points, didn't they? They talked about a peace that fosters genuine happiness and security for the Ukrainian people, not just a return to the pre-war status quo.
They used that phrase, being happy and secure, not just survive. And it really stuck with me.
It's a powerful image that speaks to a deeper yearning, a desire for something more than just the absence of conflict.
They seem to believe that true peace requires allowing Ukraine to chart its own course, free from the influence of both Russia and the West.
They see genuine independence as the key to a brighter future for Ukraine, a future where Ukrainians can determine their own destiny without external pressures and manipulation.
That's a crucial point to consider, isn't it? Because peace is not just about the absence of war. It's about creating conditions where people can thrive. Where they can live with dignity and hope, and where they have a voice in shaping their own future.
And it's a vision worth fighting for, not just in Ukraine, but everywhere in the world.
Okay, so as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with one final thought. The source we've been analyzing stresses the importance of a future where Ukrainians can be happy and secure, not just survive.
It's a powerful and evocative image, and it raises a crucial question for all of us to consider.
Which is,
what would a truly successful peace look like, and how can different stakeholders work towards that goal?
It's a question that challenges us to move beyond simplistic solutions and to grapple with the complexities of peace building in a world that's increasingly interconnected and interdependent.
Because achieving a lasting peace requires more than just silencing the guns. It requires addressing the root causes of conflict, fostering dialogue and understanding, and creating a society where all citizens feel valued and respected.
It's about building bridges, not walls. It's about seeing our common humanity even in the midst of difference and division. And it's about recognizing that peace is not just a destination, but a journey, one that requires continuous effort, commitment, and a willingness to learn and grow along the way.
And that's a journey worth taking, isn't it? Not just for the sake of Ukraine, but for the sake of all humanity.
As you head into that meeting with your international colleagues, I encourage you to keep these insights in mind. Engage in those conversations with an open mind, a critical lens, and a deep sense of empathy.
Because the more we understand each other's perspectives, the better equipped we'll be to work towards a more peaceful and just world.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about. Empowering you with knowledge, expanding your horizons, and inspiring you to make a difference in the world.
Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking truth. So there's this this other point I think is pretty crucial for your meeting prep.
Okay.
You remember how we were just discussing, the human cost of the war?
Yeah.
Well, the source, it goes beyond, just kind of stating the facts and figures.
Oh.
They really try to paint a picture of what they believe a truly successful peace would look like for Ukraine.
Okay, so more than just, like a ceasefire or a withdrawal of troops.
Yeah, they argue that true peace can't just come from silencing the guns. It requires creating a future where Ukrainians are not just surviving, but thriving.
Thriving, yeah.
And they use this really powerful phrase.
Okay.
Being happy and secure, not just survive.
That's a really poignant way to put it.
Yeah.
So they're talking about something much deeper than just the absence of war. Yeah. Right?
Exactly, like a sense of hope, the ability to rebuild lives, to dream again.
Yeah.
They suggest that a truly successful peace would allow Ukrainians to reclaim their sense of agency,
Okay.
have a voice in shaping their own destiny,
Right.
and to pursue their own vision of happiness.
Thinking about your meeting, this adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not just about geopolitical strategy.
Right.
It's about people's lives, their hopes for the future.
You hit the nail on the head. The source really seems to believe that true peace, it needs to address not only the physical and economic damage of war, but also the psychological and social wounds.
So it's about healing the fabric of society then, restoring trust and creating an environment where people can, feel safe and secure and empowered to rebuild their lives.
Exactly.
So you're saying that by going into this meeting,
Yeah.
you can bring a more nuanced perspective to the table.
Right. It's not just about negotiating borders or troop withdrawals. It's about understanding what peace truly means for the people who have lived through this conflict.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And that kind of leads us to another interesting point.
Right.
The source seems to suggest that a truly independent Ukraine, free from the influence of both Russia and the West,
Wow.
is really essential for achieving this kind of peace.
That's a bold statement.
Yeah.
So they're essentially saying that external influence, regardless of where it comes from, is detrimental to Ukraine's long-term well-being.
It's a perspective that challenges some common assumptions, wouldn't you say?
It really does. And, it goes back to that idea of intellectual sovereignty.
Exactly.
We're saying that true peace and prosperity can only be achieved when Ukrainians are free to make their own choices, determine their own future without, feeling beholden to any external power.
It's a compelling argument. Imagine bringing that perspective into your meeting.
Yeah.
It could really shift the conversation from a purely geopolitical framework to one that centers the needs and aspirations of the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, you could even pose a question to your colleagues.
Oh, yeah.
What would a truly successful peace look like from the perspective of ordinary Ukrainians? Not just, from the perspective of governments and international organizations.
I like that.
It's a question that could spark some pretty fascinating discussion.
That's a brilliant idea. It's amazing how this deep dive is not only informing me, but giving me concrete ways to engage in these complex conversations.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
But speaking of complexity,
Okay.
this whole discussion about peace and sovereignty, makes me wonder about the broader implications of this conflict. What does this deep dive tell us about the state of global affairs?
That is a great question.
Yeah.
And it brings us to one of the most important takeaways from this source.
Yeah.
The critical importance of critical thinking in a world that's absolutely saturated with information, especially during times of conflict.
It's true.
This source is highly skeptical of narratives coming from Western media and governments.
Right.
Whether you agree with their assessment or not, it highlights the need to question the information we're constantly bombarded with.
Don't just take things at face value, you're saying.
Yeah.
Even if it's coming from sources you typically trust.
Precisely in today's world, information is a powerful tool that's often used to shape public opinion and advance specific agendas.
That's true.
It's almost as if we're living in a constant information war,
Right.
where truth can become a casualty.
Wow. That's a sobering thought.
It is.
It really makes you realize the importance of being an informed and discerning consumer of information.
Absolutely. And this source's call for intellectual sovereignty, it's essentially a call to action.
Okay, so what are they calling for?
It's about developing those critical thinking skills, learning how to discern fact from fiction, and recognizing the biases and motivations that often underlie the information we encounter.
So it's like having a superpower that you can take into your meeting.
I like that analogy. It's about becoming an active participant in the information landscape, not just a passive recipient.
Okay.
And recognizing that we all have a responsibility to be informed citizens, to engage in civil discourse, and to hold those in power accountable.
That's a really powerful message, and I think speaks to the broader relevance of this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just about understanding a specific conflict.
Right.
It's about equipping ourselves with the tools we need to navigate a world that's becoming increasingly complex and interconnected.
You've summed it up perfectly.
Thank you.
And it's a reminder that the quest for knowledge is an ongoing journey. It requires curiosity, humility, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Because the more we learn, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
And that's a good thing.
It is. I don't know about that.
It keeps us humble, keeps us curious, and keeps us striving to learn and grow.
Speaking of growth, this deep dive has certainly expanded my thinking about this conflict.
I'm glad.
But I'm also feeling a bit overwhelmed, by
Yeah.
the sheer complexity of it all.
It is a lot.
Is there any way to reconcile these competing narratives, these divergent perspectives?
That's a question that everyone is trying to answer as we all try to make sense of this conflict. And honestly, there's no easy answer.
Right.
But I think this source offers a glimmer of hope amidst all the talk of geopolitics and power struggles. They keep coming back to the human element.
Okay.
They remind us that peace, it's not just an abstract concept.
Right.
It's about people's lives, their hopes, their dreams.
So even in the midst of all this complexity, there's still room for empathy,
Yes, definitely.
for compassion, for recognizing the shared humanity that connects us all.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful message to hold on to, especially as you prepare for your meeting.
Yeah.
Remember, you're not just discussing strategies and policies.
Uh-huh.
You're talking about people's lives bring that human element into the conversation.
You're right. It's easy to get lost in, the geopolitical chess game. But ultimately, this conflict, it's about real people, real lives, and the future of a nation.
And that's why this deep dive has been so valuable.
I agree.
It's not just given us information.
Right.
It's given us a framework for understanding, for empathizing, for engaging with this conflict on a deeper level.
It's easy to get so caught up, in the news cycle and the headlines and the political back and forth.
Right.
But I think this deep dive has really brought home the human dimension of this conflict.
That's what's so compelling about this source. They don't just analyze, geopolitical strategies. They really get to the emotional core of what's at stake for the Ukrainian people.
Right. That vision of a future where Ukrainians are not just rebuilding their country, but like reclaiming their lives, their sense of hope.
It is powerful.
It really makes you realize that a successful peace treaty, it isn't just about redrawing lines on a map.
No.
It's about creating conditions where people can actually heal, where they can rediscover a sense of normalcy, where they can dream again.
And they even kind of go a step further, don't they?
Yeah, how so?
They suggest that true peace and security for Ukraine, it kind of hinges on genuine independence.
Okay.
Not just from Russia, but from the West as well.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Is this?
It challenges the common narrative. The one that paints this conflict as solely a battle between Russia and the West.
Right.
With Ukraine caught in the middle.
Exactly. It goes back to that whole idea of intellectual sovereignty.
Right.
It's like they're saying, don't let anyone, East or West, dictate your future. Define your own path based on your own values.
It's a powerful message.
It is.
And it's one that I think resonates far beyond this particular conflict.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that every nation, every individual has the right to self-determination, to forge their own destiny.
And that's where the real work begins, right?
Or does it begin?
It's not enough to just sign a peace agreement. It's about creating a society where those principles, self-determination and individual flourishing can actually take root.
So as you're heading into that meeting with your international colleagues, keep this vision in mind, share these insights, challenge assumptions, and most importantly, remember the human stories at the heart of this conflict.
Because the more we understand each other's perspectives, the more we recognize our shared humanity, the better equipped we'll be to build a world where peace isn't just a dream, but a lasting reality.
That's what this deep dive has been all about.
It has.
Empowering you with knowledge, expanding your horizons, and inspiring you to make a difference in the world.
Until next time, Stay curious, keep learning, and never stop believing in the power of human connection to create a better future.